In the frozen ruins of Stalingrad, Soviet soldiers crouched in rubble, waiting. Across the street, German machine guns rattled, spitting fire into the smoke. Then came a roar, not of artillery, but of short, ripping bursts, an unmistakable sound like tearing cloth. It was the voice of the PPSh-41, the weapon that became known as Stalin's Burp gun. Cheap, simple, and devastating at close range, it armed millions of Soviet soldiers and changed the course of the Eastern Front. The story of the PPSh-41 begins with a problem. At the start of the war, Soviet infantry carried mostly bolt-action Mosin-Nagant rifles. Reliable, yes, but slow. Against fast-moving German units armed with automatic weapons like the MP-40, Soviet troops were often outgunned in close combat. In the alleys of Stalingrad, or the forests of Belarus, a single German squad with submachine guns could shred larger Soviet formations. Stalin's army needed something fast, something powerful, and above all, something it could produce in massive numbers. In 1941, as German tanks rolled toward Moscow, designer Georgy Shpagin provided the answer. His new weapon, the Pistolet-Pulemyot Shpagina 1941, or PPSh-41, was brutally simple. Made mostly from stamped steel, it required little machining. It fired the Soviet 7.62 225mm cartridge, a round with high velocity that gave the gun surprising punch. Its drum magazine held 71 rounds, more than twice the capacity of the German MP-40. Most important of all, it could be mass-produced in small factories by workers with minimal training. And mass-produce it they did. By the end of the war, more than 6 million PPSh-41s had been built. At one point, Soviet factories were turning out tens of thousands each month. Workers assembled them under bombardment, sometimes in open air, sometimes in factories where bombs fell through the roof. Tanks rolled off the Stalingrad tractor factory while PPSh-41s were stamped and riveted inside the same shattered walls. Weapons went straight from the assembly line to the front, still smelling of oil and metal dust. What made the PPSh-41 terrifying was its rate of fire. Over 900 rounds per minute poured out of the short barrel. To Allied ears, it sounded like a buzzsaw. German soldiers called it the Ratsch-Bumm for the ripping sound of its bursts. Soviet soldiers loved it because in close quarters, fighting it gave them an overwhelming advantage. A squad armed with PPSh-41s could unleash a wall of fire that even the dreaded MG-42 struggled to suppress. At Stalingrad, entire platoons were issued PPSh-41s. In the ruins of the city, with combat measured in meters, the gun was perfect. Soviet soldiers stormed factories and cellars in waves, drums rattling, bursts echoing through the concrete halls. The Germans, armed mostly with Kar-98K bolt-action rifles, found themselves outmatched at close range. Even the feared 88mm guns were useless when Soviet troops closed in with their Burp guns blazing. There's an irony here. The Germans themselves came to respect the weapon so much that they used it too. Captured PPSh-41s were rechambered to fire 9mm parabellum, the same round as the MP-40, and reissued to Wehrmacht and SS units. It was common to see German soldiers in Stahlhelms firing Soviet submachine guns back at their former owners. Few captured weapons were adopted so widely, a testimony to its effectiveness. Another little-known fact is how the weapon shaped Soviet tactics. Soviet doctrine began to emphasize close-range shock assaults, relying on sheer volume of fire. Soldiers often carried not just one drum, but several, sometimes more than they could easily manage. Resupply was critical. Empty drums littered the battlefields. Later, to simplify logistics, the Soviets also issued a 35-round box magazine. It was lighter, easier to reload, and less prone to jamming. The PPSh-41 also paired well with the T-34 tank. Infantry armed with Burp guns advanced alongside the tanks, protecting them from German Panzerfausts and close attacks. In many images, you see Red Army soldiers riding on T-34s, PPSh-41s slung across their shoulders, ready to jump off and clear enemy trenches. The combination of mobility, armor, and raw firepower overwhelmed German positions again and again as the war shifted in the Soviets' favor. By the time of Kursk in 1943, the largest tank battle in history, the Red Army had entire battalions of PPSh-41 armed infantry. While Tigers and Panthers dueled with T-34s, swarms of Soviet soldiers closed in with their submachine guns, pouring fire into German defenses. In the ruins of villages, inside trenches, and across fields, the Burp gun made its mark. The human side of the weapon is equally striking. Many Soviet veterans remembered their PPSh-41 as a friend, almost a lifeline. Soldiers gave them nicknames, decorated the stocks, and trusted them with their lives. For young recruits, often poorly trained, the simplicity of the gun was a blessing. Pull the trigger, and it worked. Even in mud, snow, and ice, it rarely failed. In a war where survival often depended on seconds, that mattered more than elegance. The PPSh-41 also carried symbolic weight. It became an icon of Soviet resilience, seen in propaganda posters, parades, and photographs of victorious troops in Berlin. When Soviet soldiers raised the red banner over the Reichstag in May 1945, many of them carried PPSh-41s. It was a weapon of the people. Ugly, cheap, but devastatingly effective. Of course, it had drawbacks. It was heavy when loaded with a drum magazine, the recoil was hard to control, and its accuracy beyond 100 meters was poor. German officers mocked it as a spray-and-pray gun. But in the conditions of the Eastern Front, urban combat, forests, close-quarter assaults, it was exactly what the Red Army needed. By the end of the war, the PPSh-41 had armed millions not only in the Soviet Union, but also in partisan groups, Allied armies, and later even in conflicts like Korea and Vietnam. Its design inspired later weapons, and its reputation as a soldier's gun endured long after 1945. The secret of its success was not sophistication, but sheer practicality. The Soviet Union could build it fast, give it to anyone, and unleash overwhelming firepower. In a war where numbers often mattered more than finesse, the PPSh-41 was perfect. Looking back, the Burp gun was more than just a weapon. It was a symbol of how the Soviet Union fought and won the Eastern Front. With mass, with resilience, with relentless determination. German tanks and aircraft may have dominated early, but in the end it was the ordinary soldier, clutching a stamped steel submachine gun in the snow, who carried the Red Army to Berlin. From the banks of the Volga to the streets of Berlin, the ripping sound of the PPSh-41 became the soundtrack of victory. It was the gun that turned rubble into fortresses, gave hope to freezing soldiers, and terrified its enemies with every burst. Stalin's Burp gun did not just fight battles. It helped decide the fate of the world. Subscribe for more untold World War II stories.